Another career high in goals, and he bounced up and down the lineup throughout the season. What do we expect from Freddy Gaudreau for 2023 2024? That's on today's episode of Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. If this is your first time tuning into Locked on Wild, we are so glad to have you. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our episodes throughout the rest of the off season. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we dive deep into Freddy Gaudreau and what we can expect for 2023-2024. We'll take a look at the stats. We'll try to figure out what is the best fits for Gaudreau with teammates, and the answer is probably not going to be a shock. And we'll take a look at the needs. What do we need from Steady Freddy here for this season? My name is Seth Topol, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and another season, another career high in goals, and career highs in many offensive categories for Freddy Gaudreau. He was rewarded with a nice extension, 5 years at $2.1 million per season. So Gaudreau is locked in as a key piece for the Wild over the next several seasons. Gaudreau played in 82 games all told, 19 goals, which was a career high, 38 points, which was second most he's had all time, to 2 years ago, in which he had 44 and was a plus 10 on the season. 10 penalty minutes. Gaudreau is not a player who's going to rack up a ton of penalty minutes. He'll commit a penalty here or there, but he's usually pretty responsible with what he does out there on the ice. Now, career highs on special teams. He had 3 power play goals, 4 shorthanded goals. Oh, and then he's the shootout king as well. Gaudreau, 16 minutes of ice time per game. His faceoff percentage dipped a little bit, but a career high in terms of faceoff opportunities at 49.3%, 52 blocks, 42 hits, 42 takeaways, and 21 giveaways on the season. And he also did receive some Lady Bing votes for the end of the season awards. So what does this all mean? Well, Gaudreau is a reliable and pretty consistent contributor in a bottom 6 capacity for the Minnesota Wild. What you see is pretty much what you get with Gaudreau. And it is interesting because so much of his success 2 years ago came as part of the Matt Boldy, Kevin Fiala, Freddy Gaudreau line. And despite the big numbers that Boldy and Fiala put together, Gaudreau did hold his own with that grouping at points throughout their run at the end of the season. And those types of opportunities just didn't really materialize this year, with the exception of injury fill-in situations. The injury to Joel Eriksson-Ek pushed Gaudreau back into the top of the lineup. Inconsistencies and injuries for Ryan Hartman gave Gaudreau a chance to fill in on the top line. But it seemed like the most of his opportunities came lower in the lineup this season than they had in seasons past. And he still was able to respond with a career high in goals. And you could do far worse than Freddy Gaudreau as a bottom 6 player. A lot of teams, I think, would be very excited to add a player of that caliber to their bottom six. But what we have seen, and this is to Gaudreau's credit absolutely, is that he is somebody that this coaching staff really trusts in key situations and when the game matters most. That's why we've seen Gaudreau get so many opportunities in the shootouts. He has performed to a level higher than even Kaprizov or Matt Zuccarello, some of those guys who you know are going to take face-off shots, shootout shots. I mean, Gaudreau has outpaced those guys with his shootout magic, and so he's a player who this coaching staff, and I know there is previous history with him and Dean Evison, but this is a coaching staff that really trusts what Freddy Gaudreau brings to the table. And so if you have an injury higher up in the lineup, they are confident in his ability to step in and to not miss much of a beat. And there are numbers that do back some of that up. For instance, if you look at the expected goals for with Freddy Gaudreau on the same line as Kirill Kaprizov and Matt Zuccarello, they are actually were one of the more prolific combinations from an expected goals for perspective, because they played one of the higher amounts of minutes for the season. The Kaprizov, Gaudreau, Zuccarello combination was 12th most on the team in terms of line combinations out of 77 total possibilities. Make that 79. And for those three, they had an expected goals for of 4.9. They had an expected goals against of 4.7. And so they played in a total of 33 games together. So you saw that combination work relatively well. It's not the most successful combination that Gaudreau was a part of, though. And if you look at what Gaudreau did with, say, Matt Boldy and with Marcus Johansson as well, that combination got some work together as well. They were 27th on this list of 79 line combinations that the Wild used this past season. Now, not as successful in expected goals for of 2 and an expected goals against of 2.2, which equates out to 3.16 goals per 60 minutes and then 3.48 goals against per 60 minutes on defense. So that combination not as successful, but the Kaprizov, Zuccarello, and Gaudreau combination did relatively well in those categories also. But again, not the best combination that Gaudreau had. And it blew my mind as well that the Wild had 79 different line combinations this past season. If you go to 2021, 2022, they had far fewer that played actual tangible minutes together because, well, everybody was relatively healthy for large chunks of the season, and this year that was not the case. So we're going to take a look at the combinations that were actually the most successful with Freddy Gaudreau at the helm. That will continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Football season is about to kick off, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to win all season long. Because right now, when you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every time they win in the regular season. Just pick any team to win the Super Bowl, and you'll get bonus bets for every victory. For the Minnesota Vikings fans in the room, the Vikings are currently a plus 3,500 underdog to win the Super Bowl. So not I would probably put a little bit down on that possibility. They got a few teams ahead of them in that capacity, but they do currently have the second best odds in the NFC North, Detroit at plus 2,100. Vikings, though, to make the playoffs this year are currently going at minus 106. So if you go with the Vikings, you'll probably end up with a ton of bonus bets, which you can use on spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/locked-on and start earning bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/locked-on. Again, FanDuel.com/locked-on. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild, once again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, we have a bonus episode for you coming later today in which we'll talk about Marco Rossi, and we'll also take a look at Locked On NHL prospects who has been going through and ranking the various farm systems of NHL teams. We'll see where the Wild landed, and we'll talk about that as well. We will be talking to Jesse Pierce next week. Had some scheduling issues on my end that led to that being rescheduled to next week. So fear not. We will talk to Jesse on a show probably middle of next week. Continuing to discuss Freddy Gaudreau, and let's look at some of the line combinations that were most successful because, ironically, one combination that we have been discussing as a hopeful possibility was one of the more successful trios on this roster. And it includes Freddy Gaudreau. It also includes Ryan Hartman, and it also includes Marcus Foligno. That group had a handful of time together and did some pretty good things when they were out there on the ice, surprisingly, because you would look at that combination and you would assume that that was more of a defense-oriented grouping than one that was able to get some offense out there. And it wasn't a huge sample size. It was honestly kind of a throwaway combination, but Freddy Gaudreau, Marcus Foligno, and Ryan Hartman played a total of 10 minutes together. They had a expected goals for of 0.4, which doesn't sound like a ton, but again, keep in mind, this is 10 minutes of ice time together. And that equates out to just under 2.5 goals per 60 minutes. They only gave up 1.73 goals per 60 minutes as well, and expected goals against of 0.3. And you look at some of the other factors for why that combination did as well as they did. Well, line combinations that no longer exist because Jordan Greenway's gone. Mason Shaw also likely not going to be. I would imagine it's going to not be something we see at any point this season, and so the other combinations just did not get as much ice time together out there. So I would like to see that combination used at least a little bit throughout the early part of the season. Now, it does raise a couple of other issues that we have discussed over the last handful of episodes and basically throughout the offseason as well, is that then you are juggling your centers. If you take Ryan Hartman off the top line, you're probably going to put Joel Eriksson Ek there. And then you're probably going to put Marco Rossi on the second line, then Freddy Gaudreau as your third line center with Ryan Hartman on the wing, Marcus Foligno on the other. And then your fourth line is set, Brandon Duhaime, Connor Dewar, and Pat Maroon. That'd be one way to do it. But I think what we are likely going to see is what we've talked about this week. I would like to see that combo, as I said, but I don't think that's one that we're going to see from Dean. And so we're back to the Gaudreau, Foligno, and Rossi combination, in which the biggest question of that grouping, I think, is Gaudreau even going to be the center? If you have Rossi in the lineup, you're probably going to go with him as the center, but this brings up an interesting question as well. If Rossi if he is given a full opportunity out of training camp to win a spot on the roster, and you feel maybe as though you could get somebody else to come in and play on that third line that could give you a little bit of a different look, not necessarily a center, and you give Rossi an opportunity when the first injury happens, which inevitably will, then you could be looking at a player like Adam Beckman maybe as a wing on that line with Freddy Gaudreau and with Marcus Foligno. Can add more of a scoring touch and is a wing as opposed to a center playing in a wing spot. So if we're going to lock in Ryan Hartman as the 1C, Joel Eriksson Ek as the 2C, then that maybe is more of a workable model for this team, to where you bring somebody up that's a true wing as opposed to saying, well, we're just going to put two centers on this line and we're going to see how it plays out. Gaudreau is not as much of a play driver. And so if you have him as the center, you've got Marcus Foligno on one side, who is not much of a play driver himself. But then you have Beckman, who is a guy who's not afraid to shoot it. And so the other two, Gaudreau and Foligno, can work on establishing presence in the zone. And if Beckman just goes and gets himself open and just fires shots, that could work. You could say the same thing about a guy like Sammy Walker as well. He brings more speed to the equation. But this is also interesting because this is one of the things that has been discussed with Beckman over the last year plus is, yeah, the offense is there, but we would like to see him add those other elements to his game, much like Rossi. Add some of that physicalness, the sandpaper, as they say. And so whichever guy you feel like has more of that to offer to this lineup, probably going to be a good fit on that third line. And then, as we talked about earlier in the week, whoever doesn't make it is your injury fill-in, depending on the length of injury and the severity. But I'm starting to warm up a little bit to that possibility. And no, this doesn't mean that we've given up on Rossi. It just is a situation right now where you want to make sure that you give him a good opportunity. And if pieces aren't going to move off the board for this roster right now, then there's no sense in forcing it. If he plays well and starts the year in Iowa and just tears the cover off the puck and is just playing like crazy, then you bring him up and you see. But I'm starting to work my way into that mentality. As somebody who was pretty vocally banging the drum for, let's see what we have. Well, we got to keep in mind as well, still a 21-year-old. And for every Matt Boldy that comes up and just catches fire the moment he gets to the NHL level, there are players that take a little longer to develop. So I think a workable third line would be something along those lines of Gaudreau at center, Foligno on one side, and maybe an Adam Beckman type player on the wing. And you go with that and you see how things play out. And if that combination doesn't work, you can try another. But I don't want to wish for combinations that I just don't think we're going to see. I just don't see scenarios, unless things play out the way that they did last year, where Hartman is penalty prone and injured, gets moved off the top line. Unless something like that happens, I think the top six is pretty set, pretty concretely set. And so now we get into the, well, how does the rest of the lineup look? Fourth line's pretty set. It's this third line, as we've talked about all week for the everydayers that tune in. This third line is the one that has a little bit of wiggle room and flexibility. So let me know if you think that is a workable trio and what that would mean for Rossi is starting the season at Iowa. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me have it in the comments if you think I'm on the good stuff with how that's looking. So we'll finish today's episode by taking a look at what we need from Freddy Gaudreau as we finish today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, we will continue to discuss Marco Rossi in our bonus episode coming later today, as we'll talk about where he fits into this equation. We'll also take a look at what Locked on NHL Prospects had to say about the Wild's farm system and where they rank in the NHL. A couple of players graduating off that list, which is why they are a little further down than they've been in the past year or two. We'll react to all of that as well on today's bonus episode. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out when that drops later this afternoon. So what do we need from Freddy Gaudreau? Well, I think what we need is one of the things that he excels at the most is just consistency. There were more than a few players this past year, who had some real waves on the season. I think of Matt Boldy, who went goalless the entire month of February, and then all of a sudden had 13 goals in March. The 13 goals in March was great. The 0 goals in February was not. And so for Gaudreau, just consistency in his performance, in his approach, in what he brings on the ice is if you can, you may not have those high points of performance, but if you can just keep it consistent, you eliminate some of those dead zones that that just end up being a lot to try to overcome. Especially when it's happening to a bunch of different players all at the same time, which is what it seemed like we had this past season. So just consistency in approach, consistency in play on the ice. Again, some of the things that we pointed out that I like. He's not somebody that's going to commit a ton of penalties. He's not somebody that's going to turn the puck over a ton. He is somebody that is just steady and reliable with what he brings out there to the ice. And so for this team to take a bit of a step and to, especially offensively, to try to do better than they did this past year, consistency is key. And you look at Gaudreau, it took him a little while to get going last season. Didn't record his first goal until October 27th, but then he finished November strong, and his numbers just started to steadily increase from there as the season went on. So some consistency and just a solid steadying presence on that third line, because that's going to be a line, I think, that will see a lot of change as the year goes on, depending on injuries, depending on player performance. You'll likely see players moved around the lineup, and Gaudreau will be one of those in that category as well, because depending on how the centers in front of him do, Hartman and Eriksson Ek, if either one of those guys gets hurt, it's going to be Gaudreau that gets the bump, and then you'll have somebody called in to fill a roster spot depending on how long the injuries are. So consistency in performance, avoiding those high peaks and those low valleys, just trying to keep things consistent. A lot of shootout goals would be super helpful as well, especially in the regular season. But then the thing that I always wonder with a lot of players, especially in Gaudreau's case, where he was a relative unknown before coming to Minnesota, and then all of a sudden over the last couple of seasons has really taken off in what he's been able to do, is I know I'm going to kind of contradict myself here when I said that you pretty much know what you have with Freddy Gaudreau. And my question then for this season is there anything else left in the bag? Are there any other bags of tricks that that Gaudreau can add to his arsenal? We saw him get some power play time, and we saw him get some penalty kill time this past season, which led to a ton of shorthanded goals. Do we maybe see more, especially on that second power play unit? Do we see him get some time there and be able to help turn that unit into one that is actually playable, whereas it was not last season? Where are these other areas that Gaudreau can help this team out? It likely is going to be in that special teams category. So that's one of the big questions I'm looking at for Gaudreau this season. His contract is locked in, so there are no worries there. And honestly, Steady Freddy is a pretty apt nickname for Gaudreau. He's not somebody you super worry about when he's out there on the ice, because you by and large know what you're going to get. And so if he can just give that to this team this year, then I think he's going to do just fine for this franchise for the next several years as well. Now, if we're going with over-unders for goals and for points, with him being penciled into a third line role, not one of your primary two scoring lines, I am going to take the under on goals. But if he can end up being somebody who's anywhere between, I'll say, 12 and 15 goals and somewhere between 30 and 40 points, I would take that for a third line center. The bigger things, though, is just making sure to win those faceoffs and to just not contribute to the offensive woes as much as possible. So there you have it. The season preview for Freddy Gaudreau. Again, let me know in the comments what you think of that proposed line combination for the third line. I know the idea of starting Rossi in Iowa, maybe not one that that everybody is super psyched about, but we're just trying to see what we can come up with here as we move closer to the season. This is what Lockdown Wild Boot Camp is all about. So let us know in the comments. We'll continue to keep the conversation going here over the next couple of months. So make sure so that you don't miss out, you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms, so you don't miss out on any of our new episodes throughout the course of the week. And better yet, hit the notification bell so you don't miss out when new episodes drop, whether it be right away in the morning, whether it be one of our Lockdown Wild at Darks. My work schedule, it's crazy sometimes, and so we try to get you episodes whenever we can. So make sure that you subscribe and turn notifications on so you do not miss when new episodes of Lockdown Wild are available. We have new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.